Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Pressure's growing on Boris Johnson to make clear he would abide by legislation requiring him to seek a further Brexit extension if there's no deal with the EU. A group of Conservative MPs are preparing legal action if the Prime Minister refuses to carry out the instruction, which is expected then to become law on Monday. The former Attorney General Dominic Grieve has warned Mr Johnson could end up in prison if he defies the law. Our political correspondent Jonathan Blake reports.
Another standoff in Westminster. Protest and counter-protest today over the Prime Minister's plans to suspend Parliament and MPs' attempts to force a delay to Brexit. Boris Johnson has spent the week in campaign mode, preparing for an election he wants, but opposition parties won't allow, before an extension to Brexit is secured, something he's adamant he won't ask for.
I'd rather be dead in a ditch.
As many of that opinion will say content. The contrary not content, the contents have it.
But Parliament has now passed a bill compelling the Prime Minister to ask for a delay if a new deal can't be reached. The law means Boris Johnson has until October the 19th to get a new deal with Brussels. If not, he must write and request more time until at least January the 31st. But yesterday he said this. This bill would, in theory, mean the government was obliged to write a letter asking for a pointless delay. Some fear the Prime Minister is looking for wriggle room and are preparing a legal challenge if he doesn't comply.
He can't ignore the law. He is as bound by the rule of law as anybody else in this country. Parliament has passed primary legislation. Once it has received royal assent, it's the law of the land, and he is under an obligation to obey it. If he doesn't obey it, then he can be taken to court, and the court, if necessary, will issue an injunction ordering him to do it. And if he doesn't obey the injunction, he could be sent to prison.
Those behind the anti-no deal bill are confident it won't allow Mr Johnson a way out.
He must write a letter on that day to Donald Tusk. It specifies the wording that he must use in the letter to apply for an extension. I'm very, very concerned and troubled by the fact the Prime Minister is going up and down the country saying that he will never ask for an extension. Either we have the rule of law in this country or we don't.
In Aberdeenshire today, the traditional spectacle of the Highland Games. The Queen arrived, having hosted the Prime Minister at Balmoral overnight. The constitutional crisis caused by Brexit is sure to have been discussed. Where it will lead next, we just cannot predict.
Jonathan joins us now. Temperatures really being raised now in more ways than one actually this weekend.
Yes, angry scenes outside Parliament as you saw in the report there today, and one MP, Anna Soubry, who was due to speak at that rally, was too intimidated to do so and feared for her safety. And that, along with the extraordinary situation of MPs preparing a legal challenge against the Prime Minister to ensure that he abides by the rule of law, is a measure of the extremes to which Brexit and the fallout from the result of the referendum has taken Westminster. Downing Street insists that the Prime Minister's form of words, saying in theory he would be forced to ask for an extension, is just his way of saying he would not put pen to paper and ask for it. But the fact that MPs feel that he is somehow going to try and wriggle out of that legal commitment he looks certain now to face unless he can get a new deal with Brussels is a measure of the lack of trust that they have in him. Parliament due to be suspended on Monday. I think we'll see further moves by the government to reach the general election they want and further moves by the opposition to try to stop it.
Jonathan, thank you.
The Prime Minister is coming under increasing pressure to confirm he will obey the law and ask the EU for a delay to Brexit if he cannot reach a new deal with them. A bill effectively making it law for him to write a letter asking for an extension was passed yesterday, but Boris Johnson has repeatedly insisted he would rather die in a ditch than do that. Our political correspondent Romilly Weeks reports.
In Westminster today, police had to separate pro- and anti-Brexit supporters rallying just outside Downing Street. And if there was tension on the streets, anger too amongst MPs on all sides at the possibility the Prime Minister might be considering ignoring new legislation forcing him to ask for a Brexit delay.
The Act that was passed through all its stages in the House of Commons this week is now law. and it requires him to apply for an extension in order to prevent a crashing out on the 31st of October. We're in quite extraordinary territory when the Prime Minister says he is above the law.
After a night as a guest of the Queen at Balmoral, the Prime Minister has returned from Scotland to try and find a way out of his Brexit dead end. In a letter to Tory members, he reiterated his promise that whatever the legal position, he will not be asking for more time, writing, "They just passed a law that would force me to beg Brussels for an extension to the Brexit deadline. This is something I will never do." So where does he go now? Despite acting as though he's on the campaign trail, opposition parties aren't giving him the escape route of an early election. Plenty of Tories believe the idea of the Prime Minister not abiding by the law is unconscionable.
If the British Prime Minister or the lowest of our citizens break the law, they must be accountable. And so it's nothing to do with whether I like or dislike. It is the maintenance of the law. And if the Conservative Party cannot understand that, then something fundamental has changed.
The tarmac outside Downing Street was looking a little worse for wear after the protests, but that's nothing compared to the mess the government appears to be in. The Prime Minister's choices are narrowing: to break the law, resign, or agree a deal if he's going to achieve saying goodbye to the EU.
Romney, so can Boris Johnson break the law and refuse to ask for an extension?
Well, he can, but he might also be thinking that he's found some sort of loophole. Rebel MPs are clear. They think the legislation is absolutely watertight and that they would be taking out an injunction on the Prime Minister if he refuses to comply with it. Number 10 needs to come up with a plan, and soon, because there are plenty within the Tory party who are losing faith that the new operation in Downing Street knows what it's doing and hasn't been completely thrown off course by Labour refusing to go for an October election. Sources inside Number 10 are suggesting that the Prime Minister's direction will become clearer tomorrow. The next 24 hours are absolutely key.
It will be. Romney, thank you.
A cross-party group of MPs, including some former Conservatives recently expelled from the party, say they are willing to go to court to stop Boris Johnson breaking the law by refusing to delay Brexit. A bill requiring Mr Johnson to seek a delay, if there's no Brexit deal in place, is set to become law on Monday. But the Prime Minister has been adamant, declaring he would never beg Brussels for an extension. Simeon Brown reports.
The ayes to the right, 329.
It has been a week of defeat for Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party. This is what the Prime Minister had said about staying in the European Union past October 31st.
I'd rather be dead in a ditch.
Now, after back-to-back defeats, Parliament may have forced his government into asking the EU for another extension if he cannot secure his deal. If that's not enough, his expulsion of the 21 MPs who rebelled has been widely condemned.
But it's time to move on.
And the Prime Minister's own brother resigned from the government over the direction of the party. On top of that, it looks like Parliament will block him from calling the election he wants. So what will be the impact of this week of presidents? And what will this Prime Minister do next? So far, the Johnson administration has been defined by ruthless politics, and there are fears he might even ignore this week's parliamentary vote against the no-deal Brexit.
He doesn't agree with the decision that Parliament's taken, and he's prepared to not abide by it. The Act that was passed through all its stages in the House of Commons this week is now law, and it requires him to apply for an extension in order to prevent a crashing out on the 31st of October. We're in quite extraordinary territory when the Prime Minister says he is above the law.
Today, the furious divide over Brexit inside the House erupted outside of it. Protest and anger is the view from Westminster. But beyond the city, the scene from much of the country is a little more serene. Welcome to the heart of North Oxfordshire. After a nightmare week in Westminster, the village of Mixbury is having a late summer night's dream, featuring mythical beasts, and I don't mean Tories who are backing Remain. Westminster and the Conservatives may be in crisis, but the view from this Conservative heartland is more keep calm and carry on. But could this constituency change colour from blue to yellow over the direction of Brexit? Now, this is a safe Tory seat, where Remain crossed the 50% line, But we've met blue voters now reconsidering their allegiance.
I think they all feel very strongly about it and want to have their say and not be sort of rolled over by Boris. So we'll have to see what happens and unfolds in the next few weeks. But it's a worrying time for everybody. It's uncertainty.
He should be leading from the front and setting an example for all of us, really. So the law is the law, and whether that's speeding or significant crimes, we all have to observe it. And I believe the Prime Minister should be showing us the way.
There has been huge pressure on the Prime Minister from within his party after he axed 21 MPs against the no-deal Brexit. But there is still support for Boris Johnson in Tory heartlands.
They're an absolute shambles. I think it's absolutely shocking what they've done to him. I think he's our chance to get things a bit straight here for once. We've had these middle-of-the-roaders for such a long time. Now we need somebody with vision, and he's got it, but they're determined to get him out by the look of it.
The Brexit process is beginning to feel like a merry-go-round, especially if another Prime Minister is forced into seeking another extension. As long as the arithmetic remains unchanged, leaving the EU will be anything but a picnic for Boris Johnson.
Well, we're joined now by Lord Heseltine, the former Conservative Deputy Prime Minister who had the whip withdrawn in the House of Lords after urging people to vote Lib Dem in the European election. He's just been speaking at a rally in Leeds supporting a second referendum. What do you think is going on with Boris Johnson's insistence that he will never ask for a delay? I mean, is he threatening to break the law, or is this a bluff?
Well, two things are going on. First is the battle against the calamity of a no-deal Brexit. The second thing that's going on, and it's becoming increasingly clear now, is the battle for the soul of the Conservative Party. This week we've seen a blistering attack by John Major on his successor. We have seen a girl frog-marched out of number 10 without any due procedures. We've seen an attempt to close down Parliament and accountability. We have seen 21 senior, respected members of the Conservative Party sacked. And we have now seen a Prime Minister, a Tory Prime Minister, saying that he will break the law. This is electioneering. This, from the moment Boris Johnson got into number 10, he's been using every photo opportunity to the point at which the police have now complained that his repeated appearances in police-orientated imagery is actually party manipulation as opposed to public service.
But it's working, isn't it?
This is, in my view, quite unacceptable to the Conservative Party. And there will be millions of people today asking whether they can remain in a party that has shown a ruthless contempt for parliamentary democracy.
Right, but the opinion polls are suggesting that the parties of Brexit are doing well. And Boris Johnson's Conservative Party is doing better than Theresa May's was in the opinion polls. I mean, isn't the fact that your resistance and others is driving Britain towards a possible Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson alliance in Downing Street?
Well, you have to make up your mind about opinion polls. I can think of issues on which public opinion would show majorities for causes of which I disapprove. In fact, there are many examples of where the most appalling governments have been elected and have consequently proved to be the disaster that some people forecast. If I give you one example, in 1968, Enoch Powell made one of the most reprehensible anti-racist speeches of modern times. Without any doubt, the public opinion would have supported that. But maturity, quiet reflection actually has turned this country into a tolerant multiracial community, which is admired across the world. So the duty of MPs is to stand for what they believe in. And what today outside observers are seeing is, first, people who do stand by conviction, some of the most respected members of the House of Commons, some are sacked. Now, if you sack Ken Clarke, it's awful for Ken, but let's understand something else. This is someone who's given his life to the Conservative Party, served the government in the most distinguished high offices of state. And if you sack him, millions of British people say, how can I stay with a party of that sort? What sort of party is it? So this is now a battle for the soul of the Tory party, as well as a battle to save Britain from the economic consequences of Brexit.
Right, but if Boris Johnson just refuses to follow the law and refuses to sign that letter, what happens?
The law is the law. Whether you are Prime Minister or the lowest and most impoverished citizen in the country. And there are no exceptions to this. You can't say, oh, well, he's bigger than everybody else, or he's a nice guy, or he makes funny jokes, and therefore we don't care. Once you step down that road, what does a tyrant do next? They get away with it once, they'll get away with it twice. So you either believe in the sanctity of the law, and the law is the ultimate defense of the rights of every single one of us against tyranny, cruelty, abuse, whatever it may be. So if a Tory can't understand that, how on earth can anybody else be expected to understand it? But my guess is that this has been carefully calculated by Dominic Cummings and the sort of people around him, that he'll try and turn Boris into a martyr. Once again, electioneering on the most fragile grounds. Well, I hope they've now learnt that in Parliament and in the country, there are men and women who will not be treated with such contempt.
Right, but I mean, you say martyr, but what will actually happen? I mean, are you saying that he should be arrested or prosecuted or what? I mean, and there are only going to be 11 days before no deal.
It is not my job to execute the law. We have legal systems, we have law enforcement systems. It is for them. But if they so decide, and in my view, there will be serious attempts to take this matter to court. If the courts find it is important to act in defense of the law, then let it take its course without let or hindrance, without favor to the elite or to the poorest in the land.
And what are you going to do personally? I mean, can you stay in the Conservative Party?
I have given my life to the Conservative Party. They can kick me out, but as long as I have the breath to utter, I will defend the values that I learnt from Winston Churchill on through every British Prime Minister. I will defend the values and the political philosophy and the economic theories upon which my life has been built. If my party wants me to go, that is up to them. But I will survive to the best of my ability to give light and hope to a new generation of people who think like I do, and I will urge them to stay and fight. Stay and fight.
Now, can I just ask you finally about, I mean, a lot of Brexiteers are horrified by what they have seen, and they're using sort of that Second World War language of collusion, what they are seeing as the rebel alliance having consulted possibly with European leaders, that they would be granted an extension of 3 months if they ask for one, that they plotted this before this rebel bill was put through. I mean, you know, is it right for British politicians to have consulted European politicians in trying to frustrate the government?
Yes, of course. The government has not got a mandate in Parliament. It has not got a majority. And it is totally within the constitutional right of any member of Parliament to consult before they make decisions, whether it's for the government or against the government. And actually, the mere question that you put to me, is it right for them to consult outside people and our friends in Europe, indicates an attitude of intolerance to the way politicians should behave. I'd have thought that what you should be saying, frankly, is that politicians should be talking to our friends across the world about what is happening in this country, about the humiliation and the ridicule to which we're being subjected by this government.
Lord Heseltine, thank you very much. Well, with me now is Hannah White, Deputy Director at the Institute for Government. I mean, in terms of the mechanics then, if Boris Johnson gets to October the 19th, no deal and no letter, he refuses to ask for a delay, what can MPs do in Parliament?
He'll be breaking the law at that point. I think two things will happen. There will very likely be court cases brought against him, and at the same time, I imagine that parliamentarians will bring a vote of no confidence against him.
Right, but after a vote of no confidence, there's normally 2 weeks in which you look for an alternative Prime Minister. That would take us over the no-deal line.
So there's a 2-week window, but it doesn't need to take 2 weeks. So that after 2 weeks, you would automatically have an election. But the point of it is to allow an opportunity for somebody else to try to command the confidence of the House. And I think in a situation like this, where Boris Johnson was breaking the law, other people who didn't like that would get together and find somebody else who they did have confidence in, who could command the confidence of the House.
Doesn't that still require Boris Johnson to go to the Queen and say, I can't be Prime Minister anymore, and you need to appoint whoever it is who's commanded the confidence of the House? What if he just doesn't?
I think in a situation like this, and, you know, it's completely unthinkable, really, but the Queen has...
I mean, he might be in a court or in a police cell by then.
Indeed. And, you know, in those circumstances, I think, you know, it would be open to the Queen to sack him and to put someone else in who she felt could command the confidence of the House. I think if you have a Prime Minister who is openly breaking the law, she could do that.
So it comes down to the Queen?
It comes down to the Queen.
That is an extraordinary truth, isn't it?
That is why this is deeply undesirable, because it is always the case in our Constitution that the Queen should be kept out of politics and that a Prime Minister should only resign if he can recommend somebody else who could be Prime Minister in their place.
And in terms of the election, because, I mean, presumably Boris Johnson is doing this partly because he's hoping people will go on Monday, oh, look, let's just have an election. That's the safest way of changing things. I mean, how much leeway is there around the timing of an election? You know, could they agree to call an election on Monday but time it for after November, or you know, can they lengthen or shorten that 5-week period?
So you could legislate to change the 25-day period you have to have, but the problem is that whoever is the incumbent Prime Minister gets to set the date of the election, and even if you had legislated to set the date of the election, my sense is that people who oppose the possibility of no deal don't entirely trust that Boris Johnson wouldn't find a way around that and say, well, actually, you know, that's the law, but now I'm going to use my prerogative to try to change the date again.
Given this law has basically taken control from the government, is there nothing that MPs can do to take away the prerogative of the Prime Minister to be the person who asks for that delay? Parliament can't decide that it's going to ask for the delay, as the government can it?
No, so our foreign policy is a prerogative of the Prime Minister. It would be up to the Prime Minister to have to ask for an extension to conduct foreign policy on behalf of the country. What Parliament would have to do is change the Prime Minister rather than change the law in this circumstance, I think.
Right. So, I mean, what do you think is the most likely course then?
That is the question. I think this week we're going to see... I think the opposition vote against the opportunity for an election. I think probably then the House will be prorogued, suspended. I think it's not in the Prime Minister's interest to keep Parliament around when he could, you know, be out either negotiating with the EU, hoping to get a deal that he can put to Parliament before the 19th of October, which is the key date in this bill, or failing that, essentially starting to campaign before the election kicks off, hoping that when he gets towards the end of October, this bluff will mean that he can say, well, actually, you know, this was completely against my will, but I'm going to have to send this letter.
And I suppose one other consequence of this is that all this period of actual sort of shadow campaigning doesn't fall within any of the election rules.
Exactly.
So people can spend what they want, there are no limits, the money can come from wherever it comes.
Well, and that's why this is something you were mentioning before, that I think Lord Heseltine was mentioning, you know, the police are sort of uncomfortable about some of what the Prime Minister has been doing. There have been some questions asked about, you know, is this campaigning or is this normal activity on the part of the Prime Minister? But many people have said that they feel that it's, you know, we shouldn't be campaigning yet because there isn't an election to campaign for.
So there are restrictions, but we'll see exactly what comes out in the wash as to when this comes out.
It's always the case when people can see an election happening soon that activity starts to bear more of a relation to a campaign.
Hannah White, thank you very much.